So welcome to the May 5th Pod Security Policy Replacement Breakout session. So I think we said we are going to start with the Windows discussion today. I do want to time box it and focus on the decisions that we need to make to unblock the alpha implementation. And I think there's a lot more that we can think about around the beta timeline or just a little farther down the road. So I guess the proposal that I'd like to put out there is that Windows pods are fully supported under the baseline policy. And I think that in my opinion, I think that's good enough for alpha. And I'm curious what other folks think on that.
Do I understand? Go on, David. I think you're probably asking the same thing as me.
Just so I'm clear, does this mean that all Windows pods would be available under the baseline policy, or does this mean that some Windows pods would be available under the baseline policy?
I'm actually not sure what the status of privileged Windows pods is. I know there's a KEP in the works for it. Does someone from Windows?
We hope to have an alpha implementation for those in 122. Those will use a completely different set of fields to identify them as privileged. So under the security context, there's a Windows security context options field. And under those fields, there will be a new field called host process to differentiate Windows privileged containers versus the existing privileged containers.
And because it's a new field and it's a definitive field, that would actually be really easy to slot under the privileged baseline restricted policies. So just like host network and host IPC are forbidden in baseline unrestricted, host process would also be restricted or forbidden in baseline unrestricted.
The one other thing that I'd like to add, oh, go ahead, Tab.
I wanted to ask Mark, do I understand correctly that right now, without privileged Windows containers, it's still widely known and a matter of design that two Windows containers on the same host can affect each other and affect the host in ways that we do not expect from a baseline Linux pod? Like that all Windows containers are essentially privileged at this point, not like in the privileged sense, but like in the you can just escape the container and do things on the host sense?
Yes and no. I think that this is, I actually don't have all of the context here. People from our container platform team can add some. So they are saying that the official statement is that, so let me back up one sec. Windows itself supports multiple different types of containers. There's one that's called process isolated containers, and then another one that's Hyper-V isolated containers. Currently, Kubernetes only supports process isolated containers. And the official stance from Microsoft is that process isolated containers are not a security boundary. They do make an attempt to patch holes if there are escapes that are kind of well-known and circulated, but it's not something that will necessarily always get treated as like a CVE. Hyper-V isolated containers are considered a security boundary, and we do hope to enable those in Kubernetes at some point. There was, I think we have some proof of concepts working, but largely that was punted until Containerd was fully supported, which it is now, so we need to pick that up again. But so that, yes, the current implementation of containers are not considered security boundaries.
But they are best effort, it sounds like, which is better than I thought. I thought it was like, yeah, everybody knows you can just hop out and touch the whole host, which would make the discussion about those being on the baseline policy different than there is a best effort put into isolating those. That definitely makes it sound like there's a meaningful distinction between the new privileged Windows containers and baseline ones that makes it make sense to allow normal Windows pods in the baseline policy, and perhaps someday in the future when Hyper-V isolated containers are more mainstream, that could be a change that like we could have a release where normal non-Hyper-V process model containers would be warned on and then eventually no longer allowed under the baseline policy. But we're not there yet.
Potentially, yes. I need to double check what the latest is, but all I've heard recently was that there is a best effort to fix any security gaps, but there's not the same rigor around patching them necessarily and disclosure as other Windows vulnerabilities.
Then I like your proposal, Tim. Let's do it.
Yeah, it sounds like we should definitely block this new privileged field under baseline. And also, we don't need to know if the pod actually is a Windows pod or a Linux pod to restrict the usage of that field.
Right.
That is correct.
Right.
One thing that I did want to mention that this has come up in the past before, though, is we've seen cluster operators set policies restricting the user ID for containers to certain ranges across the board. And Windows users operate differently. So Windows use like on Linux, the containers an integer that's the reference as a user on the system. Windows containers use a different field, which is also under that security context field called run as username. Usernames are just strings for Windows containers. And we have seen issues in the past where when cluster operators do set up blanket policy that restricts the user IDs for that containers can run in, Windows containers were unable to start because of just the activation logic in the kubelet. So if at all possible, I believe most of those cases have been kind of resolved in the kubelet where the kubelet knows what OS is running on, and it knows, I think it just throws a warning and says, hey, these fields are not applicable to Windows, so please don't set them. But that might be something to consider moving forward. Is we've seen cases where new functionality is added, and sometimes we in the Windows or SIG don't catch them, and then it can lead to issues starting Windows containers that were well-intentioned.
Same thing with the AppArmor a few releases ago that we caught. So I know that's in the baseline, so we probably want to just make sure that that gets, if we're on a Windows machine, we don't apply that.
Yeah, so along those.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, along those lines, the restricted policy as it's defined now is definitely going to break Windows pods. It requires a bunch of those Linux fields to be set. And so that's where I was suggesting that for namespaces with Windows containers, that we should just set them as baseline, at least for the alpha. And then in the future, we can explore more what restricted means in the Windows context, and also how to identify and actually distinguish the operating system that's being targeted.
I think that could work. I will point out that there are a number of, pretty core scenarios that do schedule daemon sets into a cluster that will run with that set up functionality for Linux and Linux. A lot of the storage plugins and the CSI plugins are one. So that is just one concern, is that if we if we go that route, then all of a sudden the namespace that we're using to schedule these daemon sets into would need to not be set as restricted without updating a lot of the deployment files to make sure they get scheduled to separate namespaces.
I do wonder how many of those use cases are already privileged, though, CSI drivers in particular.
That is a good point.
Yeah, I like the daemon level stuff or the
Yeah.
or the system level stuff. I don't really expect to be trying to mix. Like, I'm going to run some restricted things, but I also want to run this super user thing.
Our design discourages you from doing that, and rightly so.
So I mean, it sounds like by default, if this feature was on, you actually have to opt into being restricted beyond the privilege level to begin with. So by default, we certainly wouldn't break any Windows deployments. But even the baseline policy would allow Windows pods to express what they can currently express. Some of the more privileged things like host process that are coming, I think we would want to slot into only being allowed in the privileged policy. So I think I agree with Tim and Mark that the specific area of concern is sort of around Linuxisms that are mostly or completely in the restricted policy. And as we have a good way to identify, like definitively, a Windows pod, I would be open to saying like, what makes sense for a Windows pod here? Like run as user UID doesn't make sense for a pod that we know is going to run as a Windows container. But maybe the like Windows GMSA or run as username fields, maybe we would have opinions about those things. So those are the types of things I would expect to see folded into restricted policy updates as we gain that capability in the future.
Plus one to that, and to take that a little bit further, it sounds like with the current isolation properties of Windows pods, I wouldn't want to allow any Windows pods in a namespace that was set to restricted anyway. But as more hardening measures become available for container runtime on Windows, then the restricted policy, when it identifies a Windows pod, could require those hardening measures in a way that is analogous to requiring the additional hardening measures on Linux pods.
Yeah, and that's really where like the versioning of the restricted policy comes into play. So you could say, like, I want everything restricted as of 122. And then if in 124, we figure out a way to identify Windows pods definitively, and we get a way to express hypervisor isolation, then the 124 version of the restricted policy could say, if you're a Windows pod, you need to be hypervisor isolated.
And I'll comment. So our prototypes for enabling the Hyper-V isolated containers all revolved around using runtime classes to specify workloads with the pods. So I think that will also align with some of the discussions about how to identify Windows containers and apply policies to Windows versus Linux containers.
So if I understood correctly, what we are trying to say here is we will try to identify a Windows pod definitively in 124 where the option is much more restrictive, which is perhaps it will be enabled by default. Is that right?
124 was a hypothetical future release.
Yes.
In some future release, when we gain the ability to definitively identify a Windows pod in the API, then it would be possible to separate restricted policy enforcement for Linux-specific fields or Windows-specific fields.
That makes sense. Okay. Yeah.
Do we want to also just try and add something into this proposal that says for those Linux-specific fields, as they come up, we will try to address any of that in the kubelet where we can know the OS and say, hey, this, like, even if this is enforced and doesn't make sense for a Windows container or pod, that will just throw a warning where we can
I don't think we have enough information at admission time to do that, because by the time it gets down to the kubelet, we've already let it in. This is kind of the problem with like the run as non-root flag too.
So you could require fields to be set in the API that are ignored at runtime. Like you could say, yes, lock down everything, run as a specific non-root UID, set my Windows username to something other than administrator, turn on AppArmor, turn on SE Linux, like do all the things, and then have a runtime be like, I'm Windows. SE Linux makes no sense here. I'm going to ignore
I
it.
would hate to encourage somebody to put those kind of weird, misleading configurations in, though, even if they would
Yeah.
technically work.
It's certainly nicer for categorical things like this is a Linux pod, this is a Windows pod. Like, yes, enforce Linux options. Yes, enforce Windows options. When we don't know, if we can't tell, maybe this is a pod that is running an image that is multi-arch or something crazy. Like, then yeah, you gotta say run as non-root if I'm Linux and run as hypervisor isolated if I'm Windows, because you're not telling us what this pod is.
And that matters for cases where I am running some container that has to be run on Windows, but is logically part of an app that I want to keep in one namespace that is logically restricted, right? So I don't think it's going to be rare. It's not the daemons case, but it is I have an app, part of it runs on Linux, part of it runs on Windows, and it is restricted.
Yeah, and a very common usage pattern we see for Windows containers is people are taking, apps that were already existing and running on like on-prem services and bringing them up to the cloud. And when they do that, they tend to keep like the business logic units as Windows containers, but re-architect some of like egress and ingress and everything to run on Windows containers. And those do like to run in the same namespace. So we do see a lot of mixed deployments for workloads.
Yeah, the kind of runtime exceptions make sense to me. I'm hesitant to make a statement about that in this cap because I think it's sort of orthogonal and probably also falls more in the SIG-node purview.
I think it's worth explaining the impact of not handling this so that when we go to SIG-node to explain this, they will understand why it can't be solved at an API. So at least describing the problem and the use case around, I have an overall app that has different units. Some run on Linux, some run on Windows. It is restricted, and I want to have a way to use this feature.
Yeah, I don't
So
think we
like
need to go
adding some commentary to the cap, but not addressing it with a feature.
Yeah, I just maybe something that we can point to as we do need to do PRs to address some of these issues as they come up, like in the kubelet, to say, hey, here's the rationale behind we're doing this, so we don't need to re-explain to reviewers every time why that's happening. But I don't think we need to go through and like audit everything and say these are the fields that we need to make sure are checked at the kubelet in this case for this cap, at least for alpha.
Makes sense.
I think we sort of do that, right? I mean, in kubelet currently, we sort of identify if it's a Linux security option. We try to strip it off in the kubelet code. Are you saying that that has to be official and has to be put in the cap?
I'm saying like we did that for some fields, and mostly those are reactionary. Like somebody tried to set a policy that said, I want AppArmor on every pod in these namespaces, and then they were unable to schedule Windows workloads there. So just I guess saying that for now that this is a general strategy that we'll use to address those issues as they come up might be sufficient.
I see.
Okay. I took a note to explain that in the cap as well. I think we're basically all in agreement here. So I'd like to move on to a couple of the other remaining issues. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can you all see this? So we do need to pick a name. I'm going to see if we can run through these other ones in 10 minutes and then use the remaining time to talk naming. I just wanted to call out that I did rename allow, to enforce based on our previous discussions. I think folks were open to both options. So on capabilities, I did add an agenda item to Signode yesterday and kind of raise the current proposal for capabilities there. And generally, there wasn't any pushback. I think folks were okay with that. Let me just pull up that current proposal. Yeah, what we're proposing is for baseline to allow all capabilities in the Docker default set to be added except for CapNet raw. There's also some discussion around what to do in restricted. Previously, I was thinking that we could just have the same, allow the same set to be added to restricted, since capabilities are meaningless in restricted anyway. For the sake of clarity, I think it might make sense to just forbid any capabilities from being added in restricted mode, since they're meaningless anyway.
So Tim, one question on the restricted mode. Like, could you remind me if like root user is allowed in the restricted mode? Or
No, so that's the main difference, is that you must run as non-root and set no new privs.
So here's the thing though, like when I tend to follow up on that at some point, but when we fix ambient capabilities, then non-root users will also get capabilities. So
Yeah.
At
So-
that point, the capabilities will matter there.
Yeah, definitely. So we'll need to revisit this policy when we add ambient capabilities.
Well, I mean, do we want to take the API surface? Do we want to define the API surface based on sort of a bug or a gap in the underlying aspect? Like from a security perspective, do we consider these things problematic for a restricted pod to add?
Right, or to put it another way, should we say we don't, that if it, for the restricted one, never, not allowing the addition of capabilities makes sense, even if they could add them?
Like saying if we fix the ambient capabilities in the future, we would revisit this, to me says we actually don't mind if restricted pods follow the drop all and then add back some.
And I'm thinking we don't want them to add back any.
I think that there's harmless ones that they can and ought to be able to add back, especially once they have ambient capabilities. CapNet bind being, NetBind service being sort of the canonical example.
Right.
But
I have my own IP. I want to bind on port 443, please.
yeah.
So
Yeah, but potentially also some of the other ones. I think that all of the capabilities that don't harm the integrity of the namespace and C group isolation totally makes sense to be removed and added back, or even set as ambient.
how about looking at the list we use in Cryo? So we've been using a subset of that list. We dropped 4 more compared to this list.
Yeah. And my concern is that for people to, so if restricted is really intended to be, good, tight restriction, I guess the next one up, are we saying that the next one up is allowed to run, I forget all the names, apologies, but the middle one is allowed to run as root? We have
Yes,
3, right?
But yeah, baseline can run as root, and that's unfortunate, but
That is
has to
unfortunate.
stay that way until people's Docker files start specifying non-root users. That's unfortunately, if this is boiling the ocean, that's really boiling the ocean in terms of how much of the broader ecosystem would have to change. And
Yeah. So that's okay. You can stop. I get it. I get it.
Sorry.
No, that's
I'm
right.
passionate about that. Sorry.
No, that helps me understand where you're coming from. Although I'm not thrilled to be enabling that. The challenge that I have, and yeah, with allowing them to add capabilities back, is that it's going to wind up in an attack surface conversation with every security conscious customer who really cares. And that means they have to now understand more about each of those. Why is it okay to add netbind? Why is it, and what if it doesn't meet their policies? And so I was hoping that baseline would be the way you could do that. But if baseline has to run as root or allows running as root, which is it?
It has to allow running as root.
Okay, thank you.
You can do any good thing you want in a baseline namespace, but there are certain, I think we can agree, unfortunate things that you also have to be able to allow in a baseline.
Sure. Okay, so I
namespace.
understand the logic for that now. So that's helpful, but I'm not sure that, given that in the baseline, so you can't prevent them from running as root, we allow it. That's hard. I just from the conversations I've had to have with customers about Linux capabilities, we have had to do attack surface analysis on every single capability that a workload wants to add to the restricted beyond what's allowed in restricted. And so how are we as a group going to make that determination about which capabilities are okay to allow in the restricted set?
So, I mean, the fact that these are the default capabilities, like,
that's fine.
If you say nothing,
adding.
Well, I mean, isn't this the set of default?
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
no, but I thought you were proposing, I thought the proposal was to allow for the restricted one, they could add some capabilities.
And the ones they could add are the default ones they already have, in order to enable writing a YAML that says drop all, re-add the defaults, in order to make the defaults explicit. So whether you're truly adding anything is kind of a semantic question at that point.
Okay, thank you. I didn't catch that previously.
I do want to clarify two things. So one, going back to the discussion around ambient capabilities, I'm not sure if there's an existing KEP for adding ambient capabilities, but I think the decision around restricted would depend on whether that went in a new field, or if we said if you add capabilities, it goes into the ambient set.
Yeah,
does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree. I agree, Tim. I'll dig up into it, but probably take me a few weeks to get there on what the status of that is.
That's partly why I was thinking that in the initial profile, we could just reject all capabilities in the restricted profile, and then when we add support for ambient capabilities, revisit that in the new version of profiles.
So
Isn't support for ambient capabilities a runtime? Like, depending on your backing runtime, like, it's possible for a runtime to support ambient capabilities already, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's possible to enable
maybe not
it.
new, but they could. And so, like, I think the API service should not be designed around like current behavior and bugs in the runtimes.
Also, if we just said disallow setting any capabilities, I don't like how that makes it so that if you keep your mouth shut, you get capabilities. But if you're foolish enough to talk, then you get your capabilities taken away. That feels like a bad pattern, even though I think that some of Kirsten's conversations would be easier if it were that way. It would be easier in an unfortunate way where everybody was just like there would be an elephant in that room, in a way that I think would be better to have explicitly written down by saying, these are the default capabilities, adding them is allowed. For example, to support the work, like, these are the default capabilities, you already have them, but adding them is allowed. For example, to support the workflow where you drop all and then add some.
Yes, the
problem
explicit is always better.
The problem is that default set is not defined in Kubernetes today. It's runtime dependent and not universal.
Then I
Fair
guess
point.
we are defining it and we point at pre-existing context.
So the other thing I wanted to clarify was to Rita's point, requiring baseline to drop net raw would break a lot of workloads that might be considered baseline today. And so this is kind of going back to that default set. It's very different to say like you're required to drop it versus we are not allowing you to add it back if it's dropped or if it's not provided in the default set, if that makes sense.
Do we want to just take that as a like rainy day project that at some point in the future restricted might be further restricted to require dropping net raw?
I think you're just pushing it down the road. I mean, I honestly, I have a ton of customers who don't want to allow net raw. I know it will break some things, but if we're really going to name something that's restricted, why would we not try to really be restricted?
Yeah, it'll never be easier to add it to restricted than when people are first deciding whether they can fit within the restricted policy or not.
Who's going to file the PR to update the pod security standards to say restricted should require dropping net raw?
I think it's already a suggestion.
Well,
But
if
what
it's
about
already in
baseline?
there, then it would already be in our restricted policy.
I think, what about baseline though? Right now we're talking about restricted. What about baseline?
Baseline has to allow the shortest possible pod definition.
Yeah.
And so therefore baseline can't change unless we change the default.
Like requiring dropping capabilities or requiring setting a run as user or requiring setting no new capabilities. Those are things that are outside of the baseline pod. So they're good candidates for
I'll file an issue right
restricted.
now to put drop cap net raw in the pod security standards because
Or restricted.
for restricted, yeah.
So again, going back to the ambient capabilities thing, I suppose technically a runtime could say the default set of capabilities is in the ambient set, but technically a runtime could do a lot of things. Do we think that there will ever be a default ambient set when running as non-root, or would it only go into the ambient set if it's explicitly added?
So I think when we tried to enable it before we backed out, I'll have to dig into the history that there was some issue with some Ubuntu images or something. We were just matching what was already specified for the other set. So like all of them were same. Like ambient wasn't different from effective and formative.
But as by default, those things were added to the ambient set, or only when you explicitly said add this capability to the pod? Was it
By default with the default set for the container runtime.
That's kind of scary because it means that if anyone running as non-root by default has all of those.
Yeah, I think it should have to be opt-in. That's
That's
spooky.
That'll again come into the new cap, and I kind of agree. Yeah.
So it sounds like there's a little more to talk about around restricted. Is everyone happy with this proposal for baseline? Again, with the caveat that we're talking about alpha and we have mechanisms built in to change these profiles over time.
So are we saying netraw will be allowed or not in the baseline?
No. Netraw will not be allowed in baseline.
Yeah,
it will not be allowed to be added in baseline.
Okay. yeah, this sounds reasonable to me.
And it sounded like we were saying it would be required to be dropped in restricted.
That
Yeah,
would be my vote.
Yeah.
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 I think it should be, yeah.
And I think one more thing I just missed mentioning earlier, Tim, the netbind service is technically not needed. So there is a sysctl now that I think all the runtimes are enabling. So what do you think of dropping that by default, but keeping it to be added if someone really wants to?
Are you talking about for restricted or?
Even baseline, right? Like if the like we enable the sysctl that allows you to bind to the lower ports, so you don't need that.
I think that it's a really common practice to say drop all capabilities, add netbind service.
Okay.
And if it's not actually problematic, if the pod is being given its, or the container is being given its own IP,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
netbind service is the way that I see everybody doing this. And so I would hate to break their manifests that aren't actually a problem just because there happens to be a syscontrol for it.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, there's still some open questions around how to handle version labels on metrics, but I think I'd like to skip to naming first, since I think the version labels can be worked out in the implementation. So we have, basically we have pod isolation policy and pod security standards from the unofficial Slack poll that I put out, are the leading contenders. Pod security standards is the winner by having fewer downvotes. Would anyone like to make a case for either of those names?
I would like to make a case against pod security standards, because I think the nice thing about the pod security standards document is that it is a, in some sense, neutral collection of best practice standards to be implemented by anyone. And so I don't like the idea that our implementation is named the same as that like supposedly neutral set of standards. Like, and therefore I think they should have different names. That's the entirety of my argument.
I think Tim on the docs team had similar feedback, maybe less from a neutrality perspective and more from a just confusion around explaining, like, I want a glossary definition for this, and I don't know whether the glossary definition should point to the admission plugin implementation or the standard stock.
And honestly, for like Googleability too.
I think the labels that we're using, the like prefix labels, which is the only like user-facing part of the API, it could be like pod-security or pod.security.kubernetes.io. And so to some extent, what we're debating here is like, what is the title of the documentation page for this feature?
And we had talked about there being tests to exercise this component, but those tests being able to be run against a cluster that is using some other mechanism because of the way we've designed this, so that you can punch holes for particular aspects. Like being able to run those tests against this feature, this implementation or another implementation actually seems attractive to me. And so to that, in that direction, like somewhat conflating, like here are the standards and here's an implementation of them, sort of a reference implementation, and a library that you can use and a set of tests you can use. Like it doesn't actually bother me to use the same name for both. Is the concern confusion or like kingmaking, so to speak? What's your concern, Tabitha?
I guess confusion. Like to me, the pod security standards are like this platonic thing that exists on a web page. It exists in my mind, your mind, Tim's mind, the minds of security-minded Kubernetes people, whereas this policy is a Kubernetes feature. And so, like, the disambiguation of those things. This is absolutely not a hill that I will die on, but it seemed important enough to at least bring up to the group.
That is a good point. I mean, I can imagine trying to sit down and explain to a customer who says, I want pod security standards on. And me having to explain, like, no, what you want is you want the pod security standards enforced, but I'm doing it with this different admission plugin that has different capabilities and is fully configurable for you.
What if we shorten the name? So the in-tree version is called the pod security, like it's -- admission plugin pod security. And that is our implementation of pod security standards.
That would work.
And that maps to the label pod security.
I love it, except, oh my gosh, how are people going to Google for how to set up Kubernetes pod security? I guess that's the thing that I like the SEO aspect of having the name be more unique. And like pod security policy got away with it because it had that word policy there. Pod security standards gets away with it because it has that word standard there.
So if I Google for node restriction, like with no spaces, which is how you like reference the feature, the first hit is the admission plugin configuration on Kubernetes IO.
So maybe we're talking about naming the feature pod security?
Maybe. I probably wouldn't put admission in the name just because it stutters when you use it, like admission plugin or enable admission, pod security admission.
I guess thinking about the title of the documentation page.
Pod security, one
admission
word.
Controller.
Admission plugin, admission controller. I agree that calling the feature standards is weird because you don't enable standards, you enforce standards. I like pod security. That'd be my vote.
It's a tough one. I keep thinking about what there's a pod security context already, right? So if somebody Googles pod security, I think the Google angle is a good way to think of it. I mean, eventually people will figure it out.
I think you just made an argument in favor of calling the feature pod security because it is an admission controller that primarily makes your API server opinionated about the contents of the pod security context. So, like, I didn't like pod security until, like, just when you said that, and now I like it too.
It also is not ridiculously long as a label prefix.
True. And Google might return both sets of useful info, right? Because you need to know about the pod security context for this all to make sense.
To know which pod security label to apply when you're using the pod security admission controller. This is it all works out. Let's do it.
Are there any remaining concerns with pod security as the in-tree thing and calling it pod security admission plugin? Like, now's the time to kind of, if this is rubbing you
Come on,
wrong,
shoot
like,
this
it'd be good to
down.
hear. Yeah.
No
Tell us
concerns
why
from
we're
me.
wrong.
Yeah.
If nobody speaks up, it's going to be called pod security.
Go for it.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Sounds good.
I think that is pretty good.
Just to beat this horse into sausage, is the first P uppercase or lowercase?
It's one word, pod security, as you specify it to the admission plugin.
I am a little worried that like, if you don't want this feature, you go and disable pod security.
Disable pod security.
I don't know, they get
disabling
what-
pod isolation sounds even worse.
Yeah, they deserve what they get if they disable it.
Should we add like a default pod security so you can disable the default and potentially have something that's
I mean, the intent is to have the admission plugin safe to enable by default because you have to opt in on the namespace level. And so if you take no action, your cluster in a few releases will be protected by this, and you can opt into it on the namespace level. If you, for some reason, don't want this implementation enabled, you have to explicitly disable it. I am okay with that. If
To
the
make it a
admin is
joke.
uncomfortable disabling this, they don't want to replace it with anything else. If they're replacing it with something else, like some other admission policy thing, then they know what they're doing and they say, we're disabling it because we're using this instead. If they're not replacing it with nothing, hopefully they trust their users entirely, or they should feel bad.
And to make this a rhetorical joke, you're disabling pod security because you're a gatekeeper. Like, to your point, you would turn this off because you know that you've replaced it with something that provides better protection in your use case, or because all your users are admin and all your workloads are privileged, and like you're just aware that the cluster is dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How about if we send this to the list and maybe update the working title and see if anyone has anything they want to yell about in the next couple days?
Sounds good. I did just want to suggest standard pod security, which is partly funny because we rejected pod security standards. But
I kind of like it though, standard pod security. I don't know, but I'm good with either.
I like that it's one-to-one with a shorter label name, honestly.
I'm not talking. So I'm basically talking about like the name of the admission plugin and the documentation page. I like pod security for the label prefix.
Yeah.
Although to be clear, are we talking? Do we want pod.security.kubernetes.io or pod-security.kubernetes.io?
I like dash because it's not there's not a syntax layer difference. Like dot has a semantic meaning there that
Security is not subordinate to pod. You're taking the phrase pod security and you're making it a valid label prefix. Yeah.
Okay.
on the other hand, if we anticipated having a future network.security and image.security, then I would support pod.security. But since we aren't expecting that, pod-security.
Yeah. Rita had asked if we could talk about the username exemption for a little bit at the end.
Yeah, sounds good. Sorry, I missed that.
David, I think you are up to explain this one.
Yeah, so there is an existing use case today that is satisfied by being able to have a controller watch a resource that describes something, in this case, a build pod. And it allows you to describe it and then have a controller create a very constrained pod, a pod where you don't choose the image, you don't choose the volume mounts, you don't choose the arguments. And then that pod will run in your namespace so that it's still constrained by quota and limit ranges, and so that you have direct visibility to it. And that use case requires being able to allow content in a namespace created by a particular user to create pods that the user itself could not create. And it's not theoretical, right? It's built today. It's in use today. It's why part of the reason why the feature was developed this way.
Sorry, I think I lost something here. Create pods by a particular user that the user could not create. What are the two different users here?
Trusted user, like a controller running a build pod. And so this trusted user is allowed to create pods running known content and protected in other ways from things like execing into them or attaching to them or things like that. But the intent is to have it visible to a namespace constrained user so they can see that this build is happening and have it attributed to the quota for the namespace. This is actually the reason that pod security policy bindings work the way they work, where it can either be the service account on the pod or the user directly creating the pod. This is the reason why that dual authorization check was done. And so we recognize that that is extremely confusing, and we don't want to replicate that by default. But being able to say this user can create these pods and will only do so with known content and will protect against them being misused with exec or attach in its own ways. Like, this feature errs on the side of providing the administrator ways to punch holes so they can delegate to other protections. So the namespace is the clearest way to punch a hole. Runtime class is another way. And then the last one is a user, a specific user, not a group or like a dynamic binding.
So, so I'm noticing like usage patterns here when this sort of feature becomes available. Like the specialized controller with permissions, I think that makes sense. I wonder if user is the only way to do that. But people also use it as kind of like a super user level permission, right? And I do see some problems with that in terms of if some user is able to write out a resource that no one else can touch, including like the deployment controller service account, you could wind up leaving your cluster in kind of a borked state.
So I was about to make the same point, but for updates, we're explicitly saying that updates are allowed even if the policy is violated, as long as you're not updating a field that is kind of in the purview of the policy. The one exception there being the image. You can't update the image without reevaluating the policy.
Right.
So what this means is controllers that are wanting to set labels or annotations on these pods are still going to be allowed to do so, even if they don't have that exemption.
And like to amplify the problems that have existed with pod security policy because of that username binding, like that's why this user exception in this proposal is migrated to some place where it's a hassle to change and cannot be changed dynamically and requires access beyond Kubernetes API access to change, in order to really discourage putting a username of a human in here to like create a super user, but because doing so not only is a bad idea, but now under this feature will also be really hard. Whereas like the use case where you have a controller that's making pods, I imagine would be less dynamically changing than the list of humans who might want to be super users. And so, yeah, like that risk of misuse is always there with any kind of feature like this, but we figure the more of a hassle it is to change it frequently, the less likely it will be used for use cases outside of the one that we hope to have it used for.
Yeah, this is expected to be like a platform level this is what this cluster runs, and there are these 1 or 2 known users, like a break glass user or a privileged user that is specifically creating these pods. And it's not modeled as an authorization check, so you can't accidentally grant permissions. Like we see things where someone will grant the cluster admin role within a namespace, and like when they should probably use the admin role, and they'll like over grant. And like in general, there's not really much difference between cluster admin and admin if it's constrained to a namespace. There's a few differences, but pod security policy was one case where there was a really important difference, where an admin doesn't inherently get access to all pod security policies, but a cluster admin has star on star, and so will pass any authorization check. And so that was an example of the sort of mistakes or accidents that we saw using authorization bindings to do direct user exemptions. And that's what we're not repeating with this approach. This is a like specific enumerated set of users.
We should probably have a note somewhere that like the documentation should like call this out, like, the sort of intended use cases for this configurable option are this sort of thing. I guess to provide another place for us to discourage people trying to create human super users, but also to head off the support requests for every week we have to restart our API server to add and remove super users from the list. Like if it's documented, like we really discourage you from using this feature for this purpose, then I think that will help provide guidance in both directions.
Yeah, plus one on the documentation thing. Sorry, I'm not super familiar with this use case. One interesting thing that stood out, Tim, you said that users would be able to modify pods that have been exempted in this fashion, provided I think they're not touching a field that is covered by the existing security profile or whatever the name will be. Is that a security risk in that users would be able to take a pod that has been given exceptional privileges and modify some attribute on that pod to make it do something it was not intended to do?
So pods in general are immutable, not completely, but mostly. There's a very, very small number of fields you can actually change in a pod to begin with. So things like args and environment variables and volume mounts and security contexts, like those are immutable. Like once the pod's created, they can't be changed. So the things that can be changed in a pod are things like labels and annotations, the image, and tolerations can be added, I think. And there's some discussion in the future about being able to modify resource requests and limits in place. And so
wait, sorry, the image can be changed?
Yes.
It's bizarre, and that's why we block it.
Yeah.
So if you touch any of the fields that this policy has an opinion, so of those fields that can be changed on a pod, image and some of the annotations are currently the only ones that this policy has opinions on. And so if you changed any of those, this would evaluate it and say, oh, you're not allowed to submit this pod, so no. But if you just wanted to clean up the thing, you could drop finalizers and you could delete the pod. Like you wouldn't get stuck with this pod in your namespace.
One thing to add there is if you had like an extension mechanism that changed the pod behavior based on annotations, I would expect a admission controller to be paired with that protected those annotations anyway.
I would expect the same. And I would say that given the narrowness of the use case here, it's reasonable to say if you need to enforce other restrictions, you are responsible for adding an admission plugin to do so.
We are at time. I want to be respectful of everyone's time here. So I'm going to call this, but please feel free to continue these discussions on Slack.